I'm going to say Christmas Eve is coming soon. Now are you, dear old man? Whisper what you bring to me. Tell me if you can. When the clock is striking 12, when I'm fast asleep, down the chimney broad and black, with your pack you'll creep. All the stockings you will find hanging in a row. Mine will be the shortest one, you'll be sure to know.
On the first day of Christmas, my true love gave to me a partridge in a pear tree. On the second day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 2 turtle doves and a partridge in a pear tree. On the third day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the fourth day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the fifth day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the sixth day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 6 geese a-laying, 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the seventh day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 7 swans a-singing, 6 geese a-laying, 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree. On the 8th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me 8 maids a-milking, 7 swans a-swimming, 6 geese a-laying, 5 golden rings, 4 calling birds, 3 French hens, 2 turtle doves, and a partridge in a pear tree.
All right, well, get as many in, we'll close the door and I'll do a little lecture. Give you people some background.
Is that because we all been bad?
Well, you don't have to, you can put your earplugs in. All right, if we can close the door perhaps, keep it nice and warm in here. All right, thank you for coming. You are in the parlor of the Drake home. This house was purchased in 2010 through a cooperative effort of the Leominster Historical Society and the City of Leominster. Since that time, the City of Leominster has obtained, through the work of Wendy Weeks, who's here, obtained 2 grants. One grant to plan the renovations and draw the appropriate architectural drawings, and another one to actually do the renovations of the exterior of the structure. This is, in my opinion, the most historic place you could be in Leominster, right where you're standing right now. Mrs. Drake, you probably already guessed, was an abolitionist and a conductor on the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad, of course, is a euphemism. It is not a railroad. It is not underground. And they don't actually have conductors. Okay, but they have what it was really a series of safe houses where fugitive slaves could feel comfortable, get some help, get some warmth, some nutrition, get some assistance on their way to Canada, because, of course, the British Commonwealth, by the time that the Underground Railroad was in full force, had already abolished slavery. This house was built in 1848. Mrs. Drake was a Leominster native. Her name was Frances. She was born Frances Wilder. Her mother was a Hills, and the Hills family are famous because they brought the comb industry to Leominster in September of 1774. Started manufacturing combs in their kitchen in 1775 from animal horn. Mrs. Drake married a fellow from Hampton, New Hampshire named Jonathan Drake. They spent a few short years in Boston from 1837 to 1841, came back to Leominster, ultimately built this house in 1848, and lived here all their lives. Mrs. Drake was not only an abolitionist, but she was a Garrisonian abolitionist. That's important. In 1841, I found a public document that listed all the people willing to identify themselves as abolitionists in Leominster. There were 140 people listed in this document. At the time, the population of Leominster was about 2,000. Mrs. Drake tells us that of that 140, there were only 6 of the true stamp. Anybody knows what that means? That they were Garrisonians. What set Garrisonians apart from other abolitionists was the fact that they believed in some very radical notions, like racial equality and women's rights, which was the most radical thing of all. In the 1840s and 1850s in the United States, freeing slaves was less radical than giving rights to women. Mrs. Drake believed in both of those things. In 1843, she welcomed a internationally famous abolitionist who lived in Salem. His name was Charles Vermont. He happened to be black. He came here. She gave him a tour of the town. This broke all sorts of social conventions because she was married and because she gave another man without her husband present a tour, because he was black, and for a whole variety of other reasons. She had a correspondence with a woman in Boston named Maria Weston Chapman, and in that correspondence on August 6, 1843, she writes about someone asking her if she would marry a black man. And she says, "I answered ever promptly, as my mother always instructed, that if he had the appropriate characteristics, I would." She tells Mrs. Chapman, "You have no idea what talk this has caused around town." Her activities were both noteworthy and courageous. She was very heavily involved in these activities. The reason we're selling the holiday wreaths today is because that's something she did each Christmas season to raise money for the cause, to bring speakers to the town, to help the fugitives on their way to Canada or whatever else needed to be done. By 1850, this activity is starting to have a real impact in America. The southern plantation owners are starting to become very upset about their property being taken away from them. And they start to rumble about secession. And that makes a lot of people nervous. And the people that makes most nervous are the people that have the most to lose. And those are the people that are profiting from slavery. Were those just plantation owners in the South? No. There were plenty of people in the North that were profiting from slavery. The people that shipped the cotton north were from the North. The people who insured the cotton were northern insurance companies. The people who financed the cotton were northern banks. The people who milled the cotton were northern factories. These people didn't want the Union to be dissolved. They did what wealthy people always do. They used their influence for political purposes. They went to 2 key senators, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and Henry Clay of Kentucky. And those two men answered their call. And they got together and hammered out 9 separate laws which became known as a package, the Compromise of 1850, signed into law September of 1850 by Millard Fillmore, then President of the United States. One of the key laws in that package was a new fugitive slave law. What that law said was we will no longer allow the state courts to determine whether a fugitive caught in their territory should be free or go back to being a slave. That will now be left up to a federal commissioner. That federal commissioner will be paid $10 to send the slave back to slavery and $5 to send to free the slave. There will also be a $1,000 fine for doing what Mrs. Drake was doing in this house. In 1850, this house was worth $2,000. $1,000 would have been half the value of the house, simple math. In today's parlance, call it $100 grand. It's a lot of money. Mrs. Drake didn't care. They passed this law. When they passed it in September, there was all sorts of threats in Massachusetts. The Boston Vigilance Society, which was made up of free blacks, threatened violence. The Massachusetts authorities would not allow them to use the jails of Massachusetts for this activity. They had to use the federal facilities at Charleston Navy Yard. It took them until February to actually get their hands on a fugitive slave to test this law. That fugitive slave's name was Shadrach Minkins. In 2003, myself and she was playing Mrs. Kendall back then, performed a play about the election of 1800 at the Kendall Tavern, and a graduate history professor friend of mine who happened to attend it said, Shadrach Minkins was in Leominster. And I said, who is Shadrach Minkins? Mrs. Drake was well known even through 1940 when Leominster celebrated its bicentennial. By the time we got to 2003, no one knew who she was. I looked at her story and I couldn't believe the incredible significance of it. That slave, Shadrach Minkins, came here. He went from Boston to Cambridge to Concord here in this parlor and broke bread with a couple of famous abolitionists that were here for a fair that Mrs. Drake was putting on, a 2-day abolition fair in February of 1851. It was attended by James Buffum and Judge Thomas Russell, who would later harbor John Brown after the massacre at Potawatomi Creek in Kansas. This is big-time history. When this was the first test case, Mr. Minkins was the first test case under that law. That test case reverberated throughout the nation. Millard Fillmore wanted the people involved in this rescue to be punished for their flagellous offense. It made national news. I will submit to you what happened in the parlor here in February of 1851. There's nothing more important that's ever happened on this soil. Much to the contrary of what the objective was of the senators, Clay and Webster, to keep the Union together, the law had the opposite effect. People that were on the fence that Mrs. Drake used to complain about, the doctors, the lawyers, the businessmen that wouldn't contribute as much as they could afford to the abolition cause, by the action of fugitive slave catchers coming north, these people were brought off the fence and started to object to this activity and started to become involved in abolition. And that led ultimately to Harper's Ferry in 1859 and ultimately to Fort Sumter in 1861 and of course the Civil War. So this is pretty big time history. And Mrs. Drake, even after the Civil War, fought the cause for women's rights, and to her last breath she died in 1900. So we thought it was very important for the city to acquire this property, to preserve it. Since that time, we started off with a monument on the front lawn, which led to purchasing the house, which led to a grant for architectural plans, which led to the outdoor renovations. And it's our interest kicking off today to start to bring people through this house so they can share it, because of course this history belongs to all of us. And it also is quite instructive. Back in 2015, we changed the name of the Southeast Elementary School to the Francis Drake School. And now it is hoped that each child that goes through that school will learn the story and the moral courage of Mrs. Drake. Does anybody have any questions at this point? Well, thank you for coming. Oh, sorry.
So, what was her name again? I forgot. Her name was Frances Drake.
Yes. Yeah.
She was an abolitionist, huh?
She was an abolitionist, and she was a Garrisonian abolitionist, which means she believed in everything. She believed in reforms, which meant racial equality, and which meant women's rights as well. So she was a pretty towering figure. Yes.
Where did they hide the slaves?
The slaves would not have been hidden.
No.
If somebody came calling that was a problem, then they could be hidden. And there's some thought that that's what a trap door like that would have done, is the person would have gone into the basement, probably out the back bulkhead, and into the hinterland someplace. There's no evidence that anybody ever came and molested any of this activity, but you know, it was against the law. In places like Maryland and Pennsylvania, that would have been a bigger problem than it was up this far north, but it still was against the law. And there's a lot of rumors about places on the Underground Railroad. I speak about this in other places, and people will tell me about rumored stops on the Underground Railroad. Well, the reason they're rumored and not confirmed like this one is because she had the courage to be out front about it. And she was willing to take chances. And she was willing to put her opinion out there. She was not a shrinking violet by any means. Really courageous. Frail little lady, but a ball of fire. Yes?
Where did her husband come into all of this?
Well, he was, being a 19th century, we're talking about mid-19th century, he had to be a little self-assured because most men would not allow their woman to be public like that in the 19th century. If you look at his picture, to me he looks a little like John Brown. He's got kind of a wild look on his face. In my book that I've written about this, I found a book written by one of their relatives who actually knew them and visited them as a boy. And he says that people considered Mr. Drake dangerous because he was pretty zealous about abolition. So he was right there lockstep with her. If you're interested, I did write a book about Mrs. Drake and this house that's available, and I'm happy to sign it for you. And I also have a book about Leominster history in general, which does contain a couple of stories about Mrs. Drake, and there's 42 stories in here and 80 antique
Just let
photos.
everybody know I have that book that Mark's holding up, and it's very knowledgeable. You might want to buy it. They make good presents for Christmas.
Merry Christmas, right? And thank you for the testimonial, Ron. It's much appreciated. And all the work you do in this
Thank
town.
you. No
Thank you
problem.
very much. Ron Gerard. Any other questions? Well, thank you very much for coming and sharing a few moments with us about this important history. At my office, I can take a credit card.
The thing I just remember so much.
Ron, you want to get them both?
Yes, I am.
Now, turn around, Nancy.
Living here before the house became.
Yes, there are a series of people that live here.
I thought so because
Yeah.
I grew up on Union Street.
I think when they were going to sell it, they were going to go for some on it. It was going to tear it
No, that's just about the newspaper.
Imagine being whipped with that. Oh my God.
So do I have to put it on the slide?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. And then look, there's a picture of that's an actual copy of the Liberator. That's the
She knew
anti-slavery
Lucy Stone.
newspaper that William Lloyd Garrison printed. So that's pretty cool that they have
Lucy
copies
Stone,
of that.
Lucy Stone. She
I'll
went
take a picture of everything in
to
there.
the women's convention in Worcester.
That's cool. Yeah, Lucy Stone was very fun. I learned a lot about this.
That's
The book about Mrs. Drake.
My heart's still here. My body's in it.
But I don't have one.
I showed it.
Do you see Anne come with you?
Still on the internet. Give her like that.
Yeah. No, I didn't get here right away. You have to wait.
They know me well.
It's pretty cool.
Oh, Carol Jean and I are very close.
Just hang it up and up so people could read it when I post it, you know? Thank you. I'm going to get around you if you don't mind so I can get a picture of that hat. Or a video of this.
see you at Barnes and Noble sometime.
I do want one of the, I already have one, so I need that.
It's Jonathan Drake's.
Why not? Wait, let them be there.